Permission as power, the quiet rewriting of capability. You press a button that used to work, and now it produces a warning instead of a result. A form asks for a kind of approval you did not need last year, and your task becomes not doing the work, but proving you are allowed to do the work. A device promises capability, then gates that capability behind a setting, a policy, a role, a subscription, a review, or a silent rule you cannot see. That friction is not incidental. It is where power becomes tangible, because the question is no longer, can this be done, but who decides what is allowed to be done. Power in modern systems is increasingly expressed not as force, but as permission, the authority to decide which capabilities exist, for whom, under what conditions, and with what visibility. This reflection will examine the structure of permissions, restrictions, and authorization as a practical form of governance that operates through interfaces, policies, and default settings. It will not claim that permission is inherently illegitimate, or that all constraint is oppression, or that all gatekeeping is malicious. It will not offer a clean remedy or a universal villain. It will instead name the trade-offs that make permission attractive, the incentives that make it expand, and the failure modes that emerge when capability is gradually replaced by authorization, until the ordinary experience of acting in the world becomes a request for access. Begin with plain terms, because a system that cannot be named cannot be examined. First, capability means the practical ability to do something in the world, to move money, to share information, to open a door, to publish a statement, to modify a tool, to repair an object, to travel, to connect. Capability is grounded in material reality and skill. If a key fits a lock and a hand can turn it, the door opens. If a person has the tools and knowledge, the repair can be performed. If a message can be spoken and heard, it can be communicated. Capability can be constrained by physics, by cost, by time, by competence, and by risk. Second, authorization means permission granted by a rule set, a policy, a contract, a software setting, an institutional procedure, or a social norm that determines who may exercise a capability. Authorization is not the same as capability. A person may be capable of changing a setting, yet forbidden by policy, capable of paying, yet blocked by a limit, capable of speaking, yet excluded by a gate, capable of repairing, yet prevented by a design choice. Authorization can be explicit, an approval checkbox, a required credential, or implicit, defaults, timeouts, hidden thresholds, or opaque classifications. Third, permissioning is the ongoing process of turning capabilities into authorized actions. It includes creating roles, adding reviews, requiring verification, logging actions, restricting tools, and defining what counts as a legitimate use. Permissioning can be wise and protective. It can also be a quiet expansion of control, because once actions are mediated through permission, the governing party gains the power to shape behavior without needing to argue openly about values. Fourth, governance means how rules are made, enforced, and changed. Governance is not only laws and formal institutions. It also includes terms of service, workplace policies, platform rules, professional standards, and technical constraints that behave like law because they determine what can occur. Governance answers, who writes the rule, who interprets it, who can appeal, who can audit, who bears the consequences of error. A related term is proxy. A proxy is a measurement or category used as a substitute for a reality that is difficult to observe directly. Systems rely on proxies because they must decide at scale. Instead of assessing intent, they measure clicks. Instead of assessing trustworthiness, they measure history. Instead of assessing risk, they measure compliance with checklists. Proxies are necessary. They are also brittle. They produce predictable failures when the proxy becomes the target. With these definitions, the core question becomes less mystical and more structural. Who owns the permission layer between capability and action? Who defines the proxies? Who sets defaults? Who can override the system when the proxy fails? And who absorbs the cost when the system is wrong? Several assumptions should be stated plainly. Assumption 1, scale changes governance. When actions are few, permission can be personal. Someone asks, someone decides, context is known. When actions are many, permission becomes automated. Rules are standardized, exceptions are costly, and context is compressed into proxies. This is not a moral claim, it is a constraint. Assumption 2. Safety and accountability are real needs. Complex systems create harms unintentionally. When mistakes are costly, permissioning appears as a rational response. Limit access, log actions, prevent misuse. The impulse is not automatically corrupt. It often begins as a legitimate attempt to manage risk. Assumption 3. Power prefers invisibility. A visible exercise of power invites debate. An invisible constraint is experienced as just how it works. When authorization is embedded in design, when the interface simply prevents an option, governance becomes harder to contest because it does not appear as a decision. Assumption 4. Meaning is not identical to metrics. A system can measure compliance, speed, uptime, error rate, throughput, user growth, and countless other indicators. Those measurements can support good outcomes, but metrics are proxies. They are not the full reality of human intention, fairness, dignity, creativity, or responsibility. Confusing the metric with the meaning is a common failure mode. With these pieces in place, permission is not merely a bureaucratic nuisance. It is a power structure, a layer that determines which human capabilities are allowed to become actions, and which are forced to remain potential rather than practice. The central paradox is simple to state and difficult to resolve. The more a system optimizes for safety, predictability, and scale, the more it must replace human judgment with rules, and the more those rules shift power to whoever controls them. Speed competes with safety, access competes with control, meaning competes with proxies. The system behaves as designed. Consider why permission layers grow. When harm is possible, prevention favors constraints. Limit who can act, limit what they can do, require verification, require review. Each added gate reduces one class of failure and introduces others. A new restriction blocks a known abuse pattern but also blocks an unknown legitimate use. A new verification step reduces fraud but increases exclusion. A new review process improves accountability but slows response, concentrates decision-making, and creates incentives for defensive behavior. This is not an argument against prevention. It is an argument about the trade-off structure. Every prevention mechanism selects a value hierarchy. It chooses which risks to prioritize and whose time, privacy, and autonomy to spend. In many systems, the costs of misuse are concentrated and visible, while the costs of over-restriction are distributed and quiet. A dramatic incident produces scrutiny. 1,000 small frictions produce resignation. This creates an incentive gradient. Decision-makers are rewarded for avoiding visible failures and are rarely punished for imposing invisible burdens. Over time, permissioning expands because it is easier to justify adding constraints than removing them. Add to this the logic of accountability. When something goes wrong, the question becomes, who approved this? The organization responds by requiring approvals. The approval is meant to distribute responsibility, but it often distributes only the appearance of responsibility while concentrating real power in those who design the approval system. The approval layer becomes a shield. Blame can be redirected to procedure. The procedure becomes the authority. This produces a system-level failure mode, proceduralism as substitute for judgment. The system privileges checklists over context because checklists can be audited. The proxy becomes the reality. If the form is complete, the system declares the action legitimate even when the outcome is harmful. If the form is incomplete, the system blocks the action, even when the outcome would have been beneficial. Optimization for auditability can erode optimization for truth. A second system-level failure mode is permission rent. When access is scarce and mediated, intermediaries can extract value simply by controlling the gate. This does not require malice. It can emerge from ordinary incentives. If an entity can decide who gets access, it can charge fees, demand concessions, or enforce dependencies. The permission layer becomes a market. The scarce resource is not capability but authorization. At the individual level, different failure modes appear. One individual level failure mode is learned dependence. When a person must repeatedly ask for access, they adapt by narrowing their goals to what is easy to authorize. They stop attempting what would require negotiation. Creativity becomes compliance with existing categories. The system does not need to forbid innovation explicitly. It only needs to make innovation expensive in time, reputation, or uncertainty. Over time, people internalize the permission model. They experience agency as something granted rather than exercised. Another individual-level failure mode is rule gaming. When authorization is mediated by proxies, people learn to optimize the proxy. If the system rewards certain checkboxes, the checkboxes get checked. If the system penalizes certain words, those words disappear while intent remains. If the system blocks certain routes, new routes are found that satisfy the letter while violating the spirit. It is adaptation to incentives. People behave rationally under constraint, and the second-order effect is that the system drifts away from its stated purpose. The paradox deepens when good intentions collide. Those who build and govern permission layers often aim to protect users, reduce harm, prevent exploitation, and maintain reliability. These are real goods. Yet the methods used, classification, restriction, automated enforcement, identity verification, continuous monitoring, also concentrate power. A system can pursue safety and still create a governance structure where a small set of decisions, embedded in code and policy, define the boundaries of ordinary life. A permission system can be made more transparent by publishing rules and explanations. But transparency can increase adversarial pressure. Once rules are known, they can be exploited. This creates an incentive to keep governance opaque. Opaqueness protects the system from manipulation, but also protects the system from scrutiny. The result is a feedback loop. Secrecy reduces gaming, secrecy increases power asymmetry reduces trust, reduced trust increases demands for control, and control increases secrecy. Finally, there is a paradox of choice. Permissioning is often presented as user choice. Toggles, settings, preferences, consent dialogues. Yet the space of choices is predefined. The system offers a menu and calls it autonomy. The user can choose within constraints but cannot choose the constraints. This is not always deceit. It is a design limitation, but it has a governance effect. It relocates political questions into product questions, and it redefines agency as selection among options rather than authorship of options. This is the structural tension. Authorization enables scale and safety, while simultaneously moving the locus of power from physical capability and personal judgment to rulemakers, auditors, and designers of the permission layer. The tension does not vanish. It must be managed, and management itself becomes a site of power. When capability is gradually replaced by authorization, the first-order effects are visible. Extra steps, more verification, fewer surprises. The second-order effects are more subtle, and they persist because they are aligned with incentives. One second-order effect is the normalization of pre-approval as the default stance toward action. In a capability-centered world, action is permitted unless forbidden by direct constraint, a locked door, a missing tool, a clear rule. In an authorization-centered world, action is forbidden unless explicitly permitted. This reverses the burden of proof. The ordinary posture becomes demonstrate eligibility. Over time, people come to experience ordinary competence as insufficient. They may have skill, knowledge, and intent, but the system recognizes only authorization. This shift matters because it changes how responsibility is understood. In a capability-centered setting, responsibility tends to be personal and direct. If an action causes harm, the actor is accountable, and the system may adjust constraints accordingly. In an authorization-centered setting, responsibility becomes procedural. If harm occurs, the question becomes whether the actor was authorized, whether the correct workflow was followed, whether the correct warnings were displayed. Accountability migrates from outcomes to process. This can protect fairness, clear procedures reduce arbitrary treatment, but it can also produce moral outsourcing. Therefore, it was acceptable. A second-order effect is the consolidation of power into the rule maintenance class. As permission layers grow, the important work is not only building capabilities but maintaining categories, reviewing edge cases, and tuning enforcement. Those who maintain rules gain leverage because they can slow or accelerate others. Their decisions shape what is possible. This creates a subtle hierarchy, not merely who has skill, but who has access, and who has the authority to grant access. This consolidation persists without malice because it is functional. Large systems need coordination, but functional consolidation is still consolidation. It changes the distribution of agency. A third effect is the creation of compliance markets. When authorization requires documentation, certifications, audits, and continuous verification, An ecosystem forms around producing those artifacts. Some of this is necessary. Some becomes ritual, costly signals that demonstrate alignment with the system's proxies. The market grows because it is measurable. The organization can count certificates, count trainings, count completed checklists. Counting becomes a substitute for evaluating real competence and real care. A fourth effect is the degradation of repair and modification as ordinary practices. When tools are designed to be used but not altered, and when alteration is treated as unauthorized behavior, the boundary between user and maintainer hardens. This changes cultural expectations. People become consumers of capability, rather than stewards of capability. The system gains stability and loses resilience. Resilience often comes from local adaptation, small fixes, creative repurposing, context-specific solutions. Authorization layers can suppress this distributed problem-solving, not by intent, but by design. A fifth effect is silencing by friction, which operates without explicit censorship. If speaking, publishing, or participating requires increasing levels of verification, reputation, or compliance with evolving standards, fewer people will participate. Not necessarily because they are untrustworthy, but because the cost is not worth it. The result is a narrower set of voices, not selected by argument, but by endurance under administrative load. The system does not need to ban, it only needs to exhaust. This is an example of power working through constraint rather than through direct prohibition. A sixth effect is the entrenchment of inequality through differential tolerance for delay. Authorization takes time. Time is not equally available. Those with more resources can navigate longer processes, hire specialists, wait out reviews, appeal decisions, and absorb interruptions. Those with fewer resources face higher relative costs. A system can be formally equal and practically unequal. The permission layer can operate as a regressive tax on attention and time. A seventh effect is the change in what counts as risk. Permission systems often define risk in terms of what is legible to the system. Identity certainty, transaction patterns, rule compliance, risks that are difficult to measure, contextual harms, cumulative stress, loss of trust, reduced civic competence, brittle dependencies tend to be underweighted. This produces a predictable distortion. The system reduces the risks it can count and expands the risks it cannot count. This is not because anyone prefers hidden harms. It is because the measurement apparatus creates an incentive to focus on what can be audited. These effects persist because they reinforce each other. As authorization becomes more central, the system gains more data about authorized behavior and less about unauthorized needs. This data imbalance feeds back into design. The system optimizes for the patterns it can observe. Observed behavior increasingly reflects what was permitted, not what was desired. The proxy becomes self-confirming. There is also a ratchet effect. Constraints are easier to justify after a failure. Removing constraints after long quiet success is harder, because success is attributed to the constraints. If nothing bad happened, the restriction must have worked. This makes permission layers sticky. They accumulate. The burden moves one direction. None of these consequences require a conspiratorial explanation. They follow from ordinary incentives, from the asymmetry of visible failures versus invisible burdens, and from the convenience of proxies when judgment is expensive. The result is a governance landscape where power is exercised primarily by shaping the boundary between capability and authorized action, and by defining what is legible inside that boundary. The question, who decides what you are allowed to do, has no single answer, because permission is rarely located in one place. It is distributed across policies, defaults, devices, contracts, norms, automated enforcement, and the quiet assumptions embedded in interface design. Power is exercised not only by those who say no, but by those who decide what can be asked, what can be appealed, and what must remain unspoken because it does not fit the system's categories. There is a temptation to seek a clean moral conclusion. Either permission is protection and therefore good, or permission is control and therefore bad. That binary is a comfort, because it reduces complexity to a verdict. But the structure does not permit that comfort. Constraints are not failures. Constraints are design choices that allocate risk and responsibility. A permission layer can protect the vulnerable and also degrade agency. It can reduce harm and also consolidate power. It can make systems reliable and also make them unrepairable. It can create fairness through standardization and also create injustice through rigidity. The more disciplined approach is to keep attention on incentives and failure modes rather than on slogans. When permission is framed as safety, what risks are being prioritized, and which risks are being discounted because they are hard to measure? When permission is framed as accountability, who is actually accountable? The actor, the approver, the rule maker, the system designer, or the procedure itself? When permission is framed as user choice, what choices were excluded before the menu appeared? When authorization is automated, what proxies stand in for judgment? And what happens at the edges where the proxy fails? A system that must operate at scale will not return to pure capability. Scale requires rules. Rules require categories. Categories require proxies. The question is not whether permission exists, but how it behaves, what it permits, what it constrains, what it ignores, and how it changes over time. It is also worth noticing how easily permission systems shift the inner posture of a person. When repeated friction teaches dependence, agency can shrink without a formal prohibition. When rule gaming becomes normal, integrity is redefined as clever compliance. When procedures become moral shields, responsibility becomes harder to locate. These are not dramatic transformations. They are incremental adaptations to incentives. No neat ending is available because the trade-off is real. Freedom without constraint can become harm. Constraint without freedom can become stagnation. And the boundary between them is always contested. The question of who decides is not merely about authority. It is about what kind of human behavior a system is built to recognize as legitimate. Is not a solution, but an ongoing examination, where permission is necessary, where it is convenient, where it is extractive, where it is protective, and where it has quietly replaced capability with a request. Let us examine the structure. Clarity requires restraint.